Willful Virgin, Essays in Feminism by Marilyn Frye. Part 2, 4 reviews. Essay number 8, Courting Gender Justice. A review of Sexual Harassment of Working Women by Catherine A MacKinnon, 1979. The title of this book is a little misleading. Catherine MacKinnon is a lawyer who sees sexual harassment as central to the oppression of women as practiced in Western industrialized countries. Her book is about law and liberation. She focuses on anti-discrimination law and the liberation of the workplace, but she sees a woman's work as integral to her social status, and sees sexual harassment as expressive of, quote, the pervasive reality of normal relations between the sexes, end quote, page 220. Quote, sexual harassment at work connects the jobs most women do with the structure of sexual relations, with the denigrated economic status women as a gender occupy throughout society, end quote. She discusses the application of anti-discrimination laws in cases of sexual harassment in the workplace, but she also sees anti-discrimination law as potentially a very strong force for the dismantling of the structures of oppression generally. MacKinnon argues that of the parts of the law that seem as though they might offer hope for legal redress for sexual harassment, criminal law, tort law, anti-discrimination law, the latter is the most promising. Even the latter, however, is not too promising on the approach or interpretation of it that has been dominant in the courts. She distinguishes between a quote-unquote differences approach and a quote-unquote inequality approach, and argues that only when it is approached in the latter way is anti-discrimination law likely to be useful to victims of sexual harassment. The parts of the book, chapters 5 and 6, which elaborate the distinction between the two approaches are certainly the most difficult parts. I found the argument in these sections not always clean, clear, and well-focused. She comes at the distinction from many different angles and shows its ramifications in many different situations. Eventually, the different explanations become entangled with each other and some clarity is lost. The distinction, though, is vital both to understanding the ins and outs of anti-discrimination law and to clarity in our conception of equality and of race and gender justice. The quote-unquote differences approach rests on a picture which is rooted in what I think of as a relatively primitive political vision, one which was mine when I first started trying to say what sexism is. That picture might typically arise out of the experience of seeing females and males treated differently, where there seems to be nothing in the real differences between them that would justify the difference of treatment. One notices, for instance, the tracking of boys into shop and girls into home economics. One can see nothing about boys or girls considered in themselves which seems to have anything at all to do with whatever differences there are between wrenches and egg beaters. The tracking seems arbitrary, and since advantage and disadvantage turns on it, it seems unjust. Making arbitrary distinctions in the distribution of advantages and disadvantages is unjust, is sexist or racist, is discrimination. And that is what, on this picture, the law should forbid. One important consequence of this view is that it is not unjust to distribute advantages and disadvantages according to distinctions which are supported by real differences. So, if girls really do mature faster than boys, it would not be unjust to provide girls with certain physical challenges at a younger age than to boys, and hence to give girls a head start in the quote-unquote race for certain benefits. The differences doctrine, which I would call the arbitrariness approach, presupposes that there are determined quote-unquote real differences between females and males, and that one knows what they are. As a matter of fact, there is neither any general agreement on what they are, nor agreement on how one could find out what they are. The courts, working within this framework, have, of course, gone ahead and decided what are the real differences in various cases. This reliance upon notions of real differences raises another sort of problem too. By the time female and male humans have been processed and packaged by a sexist culture, the human traits and syndromes do indeed fall out into different constellations which are more or less characteristic of women and of men, given some variations within race and class and so on. These add up to differences between women and men which may have little or no rational relation to anything innate in either sort of beast. We could take these as real differences or see them as quote-unquote artificial or quote-unquote socially constructed. If we let them count as real differences, they can be used in justifications of differential distributions of advantages and disadvantages. Women are more patient with picky repetitive tasks, so women should do picky repetitive tasks. If we don't allow these differences to be used this way, if we don't let them count as quote-unquote real for these purposes, then they also cannot be cited in justifications for making discriminations which would help revise or make up for these differences. Example, state funding for self-defense training for women. This bind reminds me of Pat Parker's poem, where she says to white women that they should just forget that she's black and not ever forget it. Is the white woman supposed to act colorblind or notice the black women are black? Is the law supposed to be gender blind or notice that women are women? The answer requires a shift from a focus on differences and distinctions to a focus on consequences. One's acts and practices should be such as to repair damage done and prevent more damage being done. Sometimes that requires making an advantaging distinction on the basis of a difference. Sometimes it requires identical treatment of the two people or groups in spite of their differences. Sometimes it requires some sort of treatment which reverses or mirror images a difference. What matters is the outcome in individual benefit, in benefits to a disadvantaged class, in restructuring a situation in order to prevent continuance of disadvantage. And this is the approach of the other legal doctrine MacKinnon describes, the inequality doctrine. It is an approach which begins by taking into account the social reality of hierarchy, differential social status of groups, differential power and unequal distribution of benefits, and aims to create a situation of equality through legally mandating action and practice which will tend to correct damage already done and legally forbidding action and practice which tend to perpetuate the structures which do the damage. This approach does not presuppose a set of real differences and demand that distinctions be based on them. It presupposes that for practical purposes, we should assume all the differences are socially constructed, or almost all, and that they should be built upon, altered, or ignored depending on what will affect equalization of benefits, opportunities, advantages, and social and economic status. Part of MacKinnon's purpose in this book is to articulate and promote the quote-unquote inequality approach to anti-discrimination law and to argue that the best hope for litigation of sexual harassment cases lies in anti-discrimination law, thus interpreted. Anyone who is considering taking legal action in a case of sexual harassment should read this book and require her lawyer to read it. It will provide invaluable clues about how to present the case so that the presentation steers the court toward an quote-unquote inequality interpretation of the anti-discrimination laws and educates the courtroom in the economic, moral, and political subtleties of sexual harassment. While MacKinnon gives good reasons to litigate under the anti-discrimination laws if you are going to go to court, she does not convince me to go to court. She does not, and does not intend to, paint a rosy picture of what the law is currently doing to and for women. Much of the book is given to exposing in analytic detail the follies of prosecutors, judges, and juries as they stumble, not always innocently, among confusions about coercion, false identification of the sexual and the personal, false polarization of the normal and the criminal, confusion of desire and contempt, and silly notions of resistance and consent. The heart of the book is devoted largely to showing the perverseness of anti-discrimination law as it has most often been actually applied in cases having to do with discrimination against women. In spite of all this, MacKinnon has a very optimistic vision of what anti-discrimination law could be. She says that the approach she promotes would be, quote, a substantive approach to discrimination that would overturn the systematic subordination of women, end quote, page 117. She says this doctrine of discrimination, quote, reaches for a political strategy to guide legal intervention on behalf of the less powerful against those who are not likely to relinquish their place, end quote, page 127. This is a legal doctrine according to which, quote, the prohibition on sex discrimination aims to eliminate the social inferiority of one sex to the other, to dismantle the social structure that maintains a series of practices that cumulatively disadvantages women, end quote, page 103. It is a doctrine according to which the purpose of the policy against sex discrimination is, quote, to eliminate the legal supports for male supremacy, end quote, page 106. That is very strong language, and I doubt that the legislator who framed the law says it quite that way. This reminds me of the spirit of Mary Daly's The Church and the Second Sex, where a strong, clear feminist critique of a patriarchal institution goes hand in hand with a still faithful call for the turning of its resources to the struggle for the liberation of women. The author of that book later came to see feminist efforts to reform Christian churches as comparable to a black person trying to reform the Ku Klux Klan. I find in Sexual Harassment of Working Women this same tension. I cannot believe it will ever be the purpose of any man-made law to eliminate the legal supports for male supremacy. But that as it may, be that as it may, this book is courageous and useful. A close look at the court's treatment of sexual harassment helps one understand sexual harassment and quote-unquote society's view of it. And it must be said that the book is almost entirely free of the blindness to race and racism and to homosexuality, lesbianism, and homophobia, which have marred many of the other feminist books of comparable importance.